If one were to consider the diversity of life, we classify life into groups. So for example, there are animals, which would include the sponge, but not the yeast. There are chordates, which would include the lancelets and all the fish. There are vertebrates, etc. Sarcopterygian fish, like this lungfish, form a group with tetrapods in the Sarcopterygii. But in the late Devonian, the first animals appeared, which were classified as tetrapods. Today, this includes amphibians, reptiles, and all of the mammals, including ourselves, humans. And so obviously, the appearance of tetrapods in the fossil record is significant, not just because we care about amphibians like the salamander, but because we ourselves are tetrapods. And if we're considering how did the complexity of the human form appear, it is clear that it evolved gradually over time. And then by the late Devonian, there were elements of our anatomy which were in place because we are tetrapods that were not present by the earlier Devonian. So, for example, amphibians like ourselves split the atrium. Fish have one single atrium, but in amphibians, it is split to make a left and right atrium, which is a beginning of the division of the deoxygenated blood flowing through the heart and the oxygenated blood. By mammals, there will be a complete division between the pulmonary and systemic circuits, but in amphibians, these divisions are not quite complete. As you see here, and as I discuss elsewhere, this division is made by modifying the blood vessels which go to the ancestral gills to then create blood vessels which go to the lungs in what's known as a pulmonary circuit, and then the remaining blood vessels which then go throughout the body in the systemic circuit. The amphibians now possess lungs, although lungs had actually evolved in Sarcopterygian fish prior. Amphibians are not good at breathing yet. They're not using, say, their ribs and thoracic muscles to change the pressure of the thorax by changing its volume. But nevertheless, they are breathing with lungs. And so we can see in diverse anatomical systems that tetrapods share features which are lacking in the fish. For example, there are separate lobes of the liver in the digestive system. If one were to consider the anatomy, for example, of the bones of the skull, including the frontal bone, of the bones of arms and legs. Amphibians have wrist and finger bones, which are lacking in the Sarcopterygian fish. So once again, tetrapods share not only respiratory structures, they also then share skeletal structures. If we were to go through the muscular system, there are shared muscles. So even in, for example, the amphibians, you would see, the triceps brachii extending the arm and forearm, just as is the case in myself using my triceps brachii. And so whether it be salamanders or frogs, the latissimus dorsi, the dorsalis trunci, which in amniotes is divided into 3 separate muscles, nevertheless, tetrapods share features. So the evolution of the first tetrapods in the late Devonian is significant, because if we're concerned with our form, then it is evident that at least some elements of our form had evolved by that point. Now, I'd like to just dwell on the fish which were undergoing the transition to these tetrapods first. First off, there are a lot of advantages for fish if they can adapt to life on land. Now, there are many, which I'll get into in a second, but in the late Devonian, one main one was that there was an ocean which separated the northern continents from the southern continents. And the southern continents were fused to form this large landmass known as Gondwana, which consisted of South America, Africa, Madagascar, India, which was not yet joined to Asia, Arabia, which was not yet joined to Asia, Antarctica, Australia, and then certain things here, such as parts of Europe, which were not joined to the northern continents, or Florida and part of Mexico, which once again were not joined. And so as the Devonian began, this seaway was narrowing. And so there was not only a seaway, but for example, this region of North America, the eastern United States, for example, much of Europe, was coastal and near the equator. So there were these great coastal swamp forests. But that was about to change, because as these land masses fused, what was once coast, low-lying equatorial swamp forest then became Appalachian mountains and other mountain ranges throughout the world as these tectonic plates fused and as land masses came together. So not only, as I will mention presently, are there advantages for fish to adapt to land in general, at a time in Earth's history where the land masses are fusing and a seaway is being eliminated and being replaced by mountain ranges, then this obviously meant that at this point in Earth's history, and this would be gradual, but it began in the late Devonian, that these fish had even more an incentive to adapt to life on land. Just to continue that theme, by adapting to land, I'm also, kind of including just adapting to life near land. So that would include, say, breathing oxygen from the air rather than water, being able to see better on land, etc. And as you can see here, there's multiple good reasons to do that. So it's not as if a fish must adapt to swimming in the water or being an amphibian on land, and there's nothing then in between. Sorry. So the Sarcopterygian fish of the Devonian had spent tens of millions of years gradually becoming better adapted to land. It's then reasonable to ask, why would they do it? What's in it for these fish gradually adapting to land? Well, as had been mentioned before, but it's a good introduction, fish obviously have advantages in being able to breathe oxygen out of the air, because many of them do. So in this fast-moving stream, maybe there's enough oxygen for this large fish, but in more stagnant water, there simply isn't. So in the Northeast United States, trout and bass aren't found in swamps. They're found in larger lakes or in fast-moving streams and rivers, simply because there's more oxygen. But if one could come to the surface and then breathe oxygen from the air, that's an advantage. One doesn't have to surrender one's gills. So there are lots of fish which can breathe not only using their gills in water, but then supplement this with air as well. There are lots of advantages to being able to move on land, with one's fins, even if you're not that good at it. So by today's standards, if a fish tries to adapt to land, it's not easy, because on land there are raccoons and great blue herons and bald eagles and lots of things which are happy to eat fish which flop onto land. But in the Devonian, that was not the case. So any fish which gradually made the transition to land would have had no predators. There were no raccoons, eagles, etc. And there are advantages. So for example, just being able to migrate, to move from one area to another, that helps to spread one's genes. There are advantages to that. If, say, in a dry season, a pond is drying up, a fish which can move onto land, even if it's not as elegant and efficient at moving on land as later ones will be, certainly has advantages. So if this pond were drying up, any fish there would then ultimately die, unless they could migrate to this pond, and then to this one. Even if they didn't yet have arms and legs, but rather simply stouter bones in their fins, that would then provide an advantage. So these sarcopterygian fish, they gradually did adapt their fins for movement on land. There are other things like food sources. If you can get close to shore, there are algae there. There are lots of small arthropods there. So your fins, if they help you to, move in the mud near shore, even if it is not the intent to come out onto land, this then gives you the ability to access greater food sources, more algae, etc. Even in the placoderms, which were extinct or almost entirely extinct by the end of the Devonian, some of them apparently were adapting, for more mobility on land because they actually got joints in bony fins, and these joints became larger. Now, amphibians did not evolve from placoderms, but there must have been some advantage to it. If not only did sarcopterygian fish, adapt to movement on land, but so did some placoderms. By the time that the amphibians were first evolving, arthropods had made it onto land. There were millipedes and centipedes and their relatives. Sea scorpions were adapting to life on land. There were early plants here, not that the amphibians ate the plants. But so, for example, there were potential food sources on land. Although they were insects, none of the earliest insects could fly. And then so, fish which were evolving into amphibians would have had that potential food source. Not only was there food on land, but the water was dangerous. All right, the main predators of the Devonian, all right, were in the seaways. All right, so there were sea scorpions, which were primarily aquatic. There were large placoderm fish, large cartilaginous fish, even xenocanth sharks, which could be more than 10 feet long, living in fresh water. So if fish were able to leave the ocean or leave large bodies of water and then get to this area, then they would find themselves with fewer predators, maybe no predators. So clearly being able to move a little on land had an advantage. Here's a large armored squid, those orthocones, which were present here. Today, many amphibians find what are called vernal pools which don't last forever, but maybe say, after the snow melts or after the spring rains, that they go to these pools and they mate, and tadpoles and salamander larvae develop here. If they developed here, they would then suffer predation from fish, arthropods, mollusks. But if you could lay the eggs here, the larvae could develop without predation. So once again, if you could move over land at least a little and find these vernal pools, then there would be advantages to that. And so many more. So for example, if you've got bones in your fins, this could help you just anchor in place. So you would spend less energy in the stream just anchored to the bottom with these fins than you would if you were trying to swim. There may have, if you could adapt to life on land and be able to breathe, say, the air, then you could stay still, and maybe that could help you sneak up on prey. Even if you were preying on fish, rather than swimming after them, which could alert them to your presence, if you could just sit there silently breathing the air, then, your prey might not notice you. We could get into other things. I mean, obviously, sometimes the deep water is cold, and if you needed to warm up in order to hunt, if there was an advantage to being warm, then the closer you were to shore, maybe even able to come out on shore, you could sun yourself and warm, and there is an advantage to that. So the big point then is, in the Devonian, there were fish which were adapting to life on land. And there are certainly many advantages in doing that. And so if we were to then, consider many of these fish. So for example, when fish die, the currents could bring them on shore. So there could be dead carrion here with arthropods feeding on them. Well, a fish that could come out onto land, even then briefly, would then have access to that food. Fish could come out onto shore. This could help them evade predators. They could sun themselves and warm up. And so there's lots of advantages to this. And so the Sarcopterygian fish by the Devonian had evolved lungs which opened into the esophagus. Here's a salamander's lungs which open into the esophagus. And so breathing air has its advantages even if you are a fish. When we look at the skulls of these early amphibians. So this is a fish skull, but there are no bones needed in the amphibian skulls, which aren't here. All right. So one of the things Eusthenopteron would do, because this was more of a mid-Devonian fish, would to move the position of the eyes. So look at a later fish. See that they're higher up on the head. This fish was adapting its skull so that it could see better on land. So even though it's a fish, it was closer to shore. Its eyes had moved in their position. Notice that there is a notch in this region of the skull where the ear would be. These fish were adapting their ears. So if this was the ear of Eusthenopteron in the mid-Devonian, and here is the ear region of Acanthostega, an early amphibian, notice that most of the difference between this and this were made by this point, Pandorictes, which was one of the fish that I had just passed. Now, here is the skull of an early amphibian, Acanthostega. Here's the skull of Ichthyostega. And Acanthostega had the red maxillary bones as well. You just can't see it from this angle. And so you might ask, is it reasonable that you'd expect amphibian heads to be like those of fish? Because look, here's even an opening for the third eye, the pineal organ, which no amphibian has today. Look, it had fangs on the roof of its mouth, like the fish did. So if there was no relationship between this Devonian fish and this late Devonian amphibian, is it likely to think that they would have so many skull similarities? And the answer is no, because look at a frog skull. Frog skulls are very different from that of the early amphibians. So there is no reason that the first amphibians would have heads that look like fish if they weren't related to them, because frog heads certainly don't look like fish skulls. Salamanders as skulls certainly don't look like fish skulls. So these early amphibians, they had heads which looked more like Devonian fish heads than they look like the heads of modern amphibians. Here's an ancient amphibian which still had the space for the notochord to enter the skull. That's a primitive feature that no modern amphibian has. Here are fossil amphibians. Notice all the red bones. These red bones are not present in a single amphibian today. No frog, salamander, or Sicilian possesses these red bones, but they were present not only in the first amphibians, but also in this fish, the fish ancestors. So the skulls of these amphibians certainly seem to be the ancestral form of the skulls of the first amphibians. The first amphibians even then have the lateral line organs. I'm sorry, I forget what my model is of that one. Okay. But if you were to say, look at Acanthostega, these dotted lines are lateral line organs. That's a sensory system that fish use to capture prey in the water. It's not used for animals adapted to life on land. And so not only did these first Devonian, not only did the Sarcopterygian fish have lungs, which adapted them to breathe on air, they had heads like amphibian heads. Now, I explain that in a couple of videos. Some of my videos are a little sillier. And so I have this video here where Sarcopterygian fish are talking about themselves with a number of accents. So you can see that over tens of millions of years, Sarcopterygian fish gradually became more adapted to life on land and became more and more similar to amphibians. So these Sarcopterygian fish, are telling their life story and describing that. But then when we get to these Sarcopterygian fish, you'll see the same thing. And one thing I point out here is the neck. So this fish is explaining that all of the bones you need to make a tetrapod skull are already present in its skull. And this, fish, once again, a little sillier, a little more exaggerated. This is the only fish known to have a neck. It's known as tiktaalik, or I think it can also be pronounced tiktaalik, where there was a separation between the pectoral girdle and the skull. So this is a fish, all right? But this fish had migrated the position of its eyes so that we'd be better able to see on land. This fish had a wrist joint, one of the few fish that did, but it also had a neck. Now that's an advantage if you're living on land, because if you don't have a neck, whenever you're moving your fins, your heads move. But if your head is separated from your pectoral girdle, you can now move your arms and legs for locomotion without moving your head at the same time. So it is significant that one of the things that separates amphibians from fish is that, I'm sorry, somewhere. Here, if you look at this fish, notice that the pectoral girdle is attached to the skull. But notice here, in this amphibian, it's not. So all tetrapods have a neck. Their shoulder is not attached to their skull. But that is not something that the amphibians appeared with. That actually appeared in some fish, like tiktaalik, were adapted. Look at those eyes letting it see on land. It had a wrist joint, as I'll get to in a second, but it also then had a separation between the pectoral girdle and the skull. So the neck existed prior to the first amphibians. Then finally, when we think of arms and legs, the Sarcopterygian fish had the bones in their fins that amphibians would have in their arms and legs. Look at the humerus, the radius, and the ulna, the carpal bones in the pelvic fin of this fish, a femur, a tibia, fibula, and tarsal bones. If you were to consider the shoulder bones, the shoulder bones that you need for this primitive amphibian, all right, they're here in these fish. The things that's different is, once again, you have these black, red, and blue bones, which are connecting the pectoral girdle to the skull. The big modification was not adding anything, but then just taking these away to make the girdle of the first amphibian like the girdle of those I'm sorry, to make the girdle of these fish like the girdle of these amphibians. So notice when we look at Sauropterus, there are joints between these extra carpal bones. So not only do we see this L-shaped humerus, a radius and an ulna, and carpal bones, but we see a wrist joint. So the wrist evolved before the amphibians. And so in the Devonian, over tens of millions of years, Sarcopterygian fish adapted to living near shore, breathing the air, being able to move more in terrestrial environments with stouter bones in the fins, even a wrist joint. And then at a certain point, we then refer to these as amphibians. by the end of the Devonian, there are amphibians such as Acanthostega and Ichthyostega. Now, if frogs and salamanders and Sicilians, the modern amphibians, were known at the end of the Devonian, you could certainly make the argument that, wow, it seems that life on land has kind of appeared because frogs, salamanders, and Sicilians aren't much like fish at all. But the first amphibians were absolutely not frogs, salamanders, and Sicilians. It would take tens of millions of years for frogs, salamanders, and Sicilians to evolve. The first amphibians, well, they remind us an awful lot of these fish. So just like the Sarcopterygian fish were transitional fossils, having some but not all of the features of the first amphibians, the first amphibians were transitional fossils, having some but not all of the features of modern amphibians and still retaining features of these of the Sarcopterygian fish, their ancestors. So Acanthostega in the previous image and Ichthyostega here, these are transitional fossils, having some but not all of the features. Right? And so clearly, as has been covered before, the Sarcopterygian fish already had lungs, already had an internal nostril. And therefore their respiratory systems were similar to those of the first amphibians. The skull bones became essentially amphibian. The position of the eye was moved. The ear was modified to hear sound on land. And all of the skull bones you need to make a tetrapod were already present in these fish. You just had to lose the bones which cover the gill. So notice here in this bony fish, how would you make this into an amphibian's head? You would lose the bones here covering the gill, and you would essentially have an amphibian head. The amphibians would still retain not only the opening for the pineal organ, but those lateral line organs, which was a sensory system adapted for life in the water. The bones of the fins already had the bones that the first amphibians would need. So if you look at Acanthostega, look at its arm, it has a humerus, and note this L-shaped humerus, just like the L-shaped humerus of the fins of those Sarcopterygian fish. There's a radius and ulna, there are carpal bones. Even though amphibians have the fingers that fish lack, for a while, there weren't 5 fingers. So Acanthostega had 8 fingers and toes. Ichthyostega had 7. Tularpaton had 6. It took the amphibians a while to decide that 5 was the magic number for digits. And so when we consider these early amphibians, like Acanthostega, they are certainly amphibians, unlike the fish. They have multi-jointed digits, something that no fish had. The shape of the lemon girdle bones, the lacrimal gland and ducts, some muscles, the loss of the opercular bones, a longer snout. These are clearly more advanced than the Sarcopterygian fish, which came before them. However, that being said, they are still primitive because, for example, Acanthostega, it had the opening for the pineal gland. It had the lateral line system. It still had some skull bones which supported gills. So even though it didn't have the big external ones, this animal still probably had gills in addition to its lungs. Its notochord ran all the way through its vertebral column, so it didn't have solid vertebrae the way that modern amphibians do. It still had all of these bony rods in its tail, the way a fish fin does. That isn't a tail that's adapted to life on land. All of those bony rods would break. There's no ankle here. There's no sacrum. The hip is not attached to specialized sacral vertebrae so that the legs can support the weight of the body on land. So, is this an amphibian more advanced than a fish? Yes. Is it a modern amphibian? No. Look at all of these primitive features, features that remind us more of fish than they do modern amphibians. So Acanthostega is in between the Sarcopterygian fish previously in Devonian, and the amphibians which would come later. All right, and so once again I go through the bones then of the girdle and the limbs of Acanthostega. Notice that it had 8 fingers and toes. Amphibians would not settle on 7. I'm sorry, settle on 5 until later. Things like Tulerpaton had 6, and then the leg would be the same way. Okay. Ichthyostega in the next video is a little bit more advanced than Acanthostega. So once again, it's an amphibian, thus more advanced than any fish. But it still has primitive features. So Ichthyostega was a bit more advanced than Acanthostega. Look at these big ribs, these big thick ribs. That's something more advanced than Acanthostega. Also, it had the beginnings of a sacrum, specialized vertebrae, so that the legs could support the weight of the body on land. And this is the most primitive animal known to have 3 hip bones, an ilium, an ischium, and a pubis, as opposed to just one single pelvic element. That being said, even though it's more advanced than a fish and even more advanced than Acanthostega, it still has primitive features. The notochord still runs all the way through the vertebral column. It still has these bony rods in its tail, adapted for swimming and not for life on land. So Ichthyostega is a mix. It has both primitive features which remind us of Sarcopterygian fish and advanced features like an ankle and an elbow. So for example, Acanthostega didn't have an ankle. And so amphibians are found in the fossil record for the first time in the Devonian period, but they are not frogs, and they are not salamanders, and they are not the modern Sicilians. So instead, they are amphibians more advanced than any fish, but they are transitional forms. They have some, but not all of the features of the later amphibians, and they still retain features of the fish. So I go through that in these videos. And then also I just go through it a bit here. So these red traits show that these are primitive traits, more fish-like traits, including the dermal rods in the tail, the lack of an ankle and a sacrum, the notochord, which goes all the way through the vertebral column, etc. So Ichthyostega a bit more advanced. It has these an ilium, an ischium, and a pubis in its hip, but it still has all of these primitive features. So for example, note the bony rods in the tail. This is something like what fish have, not like like a life on land. Ichthyostega had an ilium, an ischium, and a pubis, as do human hips, and it took the amphibians a while to change the number of digits to 5. So Tulerpaton, for example, had 6 fingers and toes. Okay, so the adaptation to land was gradual. Not only did fish gradually adapt to land, so the Sarcopterygian fish spent tens of millions of years gradually adapting to land, but the first amphibians were not completely adapted to land. They still had sensory systems for the water Acanthostega unable to support its body's weight on land. And when we look at amphibians today, obviously they're still not completely adapted to life on land. They spend some time in water. They typically mate in water, lay their eggs in water for an aquatic larvae. So here you can see salamanders mating in water. Tadpoles and salamander larvae develop in water. So even toads. Toads are frogs which are adapted to life on land, with their drier, woodier skin. Here you see toads mating, laying their eggs in water. So adaptation to land can come in gradual stages. Notice that modern amphibians still are not completely adapted to life on land. Okay. So certainly that's a point I'm emphasizing, that the adaptation to life on land as sarcopterygian fish evolved into the first amphibians. This took millions of years through transitional stages. Once amphibians evolved in the late Devonian, they briefly had land to themselves. Right? There were insects there, but there were no reptiles, no birds or mammals. And so, as the early Carboniferous starts, amphibians have the world to themselves. And then the first reptiles were small insect eaters. Then for a long time, amphibians were dominant in a way that they haven't been since. And so in the fossil record, there are lots of different kinds of then fossil amphibians. And in the Paleozoic, they are quite diverse. Many of the lineages would become extinct at that, that mass extinction in the end of the Permian period. But, there was just, notice there was some diversity. Some had longer legs. Some actually put dermal armor for protection. One was almost 30 feet long, and was the longest known amphibian. Some adapted to life in the water. So even today, there are birds like penguins, which are adapted to water. Mammals like whales and seals, etc., which are adapted to water. So some of these amphibians, even though many amphibians were becoming better adapted to life on land, many of these were apparently hunting fish in a crocodile-like pattern. Some were 6 feet long, some were 10 feet long, some were 20 feet long. So there were giant amphibians. While many of them would die at the end of the Paleozoic in that mass extinction, some would exist even until the end of the Mesozoic in the age of dinosaurs. So Coolosuchus would live in Antarctica until the end of the Mesozoic. So when we consider the fossil amphibians, the first amphibians were interesting in being transitional forms. But then they diversified, because once again, there weren't reptiles at first, and certainly not birds and mammals till later. And so, here's an amphibian over, 12 feet long. These are 10 feet long. So the fossil amphibians, were quite diverse, having the planet to themselves. We know that they're amphibians for lots of reasons, one of which, one can find their fossils of their aquatic larvae. Some would become better adapted to land. I mean, look how stout these, bones are, clearly becoming adapted to life on land. And from these amphibians, there would be some which would evolve into the first reptiles, as I'll discuss in another lecture. So these amphibians were quite diverse. Some looked like little crocodiles. Some elongated their body. And then there was a group called the Aistopods, which actually lost their legs. They would look more like snakes, but nevertheless, they were early amphibians which are extinct today. One group developed this odd, triangularly shaped head, like Diplocolus and Diplocerasmus. And so there were a great diversity of these amphibians. Now, at some point, the final question is, well, then how did modern amphibians evolve? And the answer is gradually over a series of stages. So for example, here Triodobatrachus, as you'll see in a video presently, has some features of frogs, but not enough to be a frog. Modern Sicilians are legless, but the first Sicilians had legs. And so modern amphibians have not always existed. They haven't existed since the first amphibians, since modern amphibian groups, the salamanders, frogs, etc. They are only known since the Mesozoic era. And so for over 100 million years of the Paleozoic, there were amphibians, but none of the groups alive today. Now, I have a lot of videos, as you'll see on these next frogs, but it was emphasizing a couple of points, only one of which I'll make here. So let me just quickly summarize this. Where do modern frogs come from? Well, modern frogs form what's called an order, Anura, which means without tail. And we can break that into suborders. One of the suborders seems to be the oldest, and fossils go back to the early Jurassic. So this suborder is known as the Archaeobatrachia. And there are a couple of these frogs still alive today. So in the Triassic, there are fossils like the one that I had shown you, Triodobatrachus, which has some frog features, but not enough to call it a frog. The first true frogs are recognized in the Jurassic period. And of the suborders alive today, one is known from the early Jurassic, one from the late Jurassic, and then the suborder that contains most of the frogs alive today, that doesn't appear until the Cretaceous period. The next couple of videos, I just want to introduce it, shows some of the frog families and where they can be found today, starting with the Archaeobatrachia. So once again, before there were frogs, there were frog-like forms like Triodobatrachus from the Triassic period. And then as you look at the groups of frogs today, we put them into families. And so families often have specific geographic distributions. Now, in the family are individual species, and some of these are in danger of extinction. At the very end of this course, I get to the point where that because of human activity, lots of species are becoming extinct. Extinction is not just something from the fossil past. And so, for example, here you can see this frog lives in this area of the world only. If it becomes lost from that area, then it is extinct from the world. So as I go through the various families of frogs alive today and where they are found in the world, some of them once again are in critical danger of extinction. So these frogs can only be found there in New Zealand. If they become extinct there, then they are lost to the world. And so a couple of videos, I won't go through all of them here, but once again, I go through some of the frog families in the suborder Archaeobatrachia, Mesobatrachia, one of which is known from the Morrison Formation. So here's Dinosaur National Park, where early frog fossils have been found. It's a Jurassic fossil bed, and you can see dinosaur bones there, but also frog fossils were found there. And then I go through the different groups of frogs alive today where they are found, emphasizing, some which are in danger of extinction. Now, not only did the suborders appear gradually throughout time, but so do the frog families. So, for example, if we were to go to the frog families of the order Neobatrachia, these are the ones which we are most familiar with. These have mostly diversified since the extinction at the end of the Cretaceous period, which wiped out the dinosaurs. And so when we think of things like tree frogs and like the bullfrogs, etc., so common frogs, including some in danger of extinction, as you can see here, found only on those islands. Most of these have arisen since the extinction of dinosaurs. So not only haven't frogs existed throughout, the history of the world, they have not. They haven't existed throughout all of the history of amphibians, because in the Paleozoic there were no frogs. But then even in the Mesozoic and more recent times, frogs have evolved gradually in stages, with some of the frogs that we have today, such as the tree frogs in the family Hylidae. These diversified after the extinction, which wiped out the dinosaurs. So they are not, distributed all throughout history. So the first tree frogs are known in the Paleocene after the extinction of the dinosaurs. Okay. Now, this is true of frogs and also true of salamanders. So we could do the same with salamanders. Salamanders haven't always existed. One can split them into different sub-orders, which have evolved gradually over time. And I have information on that, including some of the modern species which are in danger of extinction. So at the end of this course, once again, or the course that I teach, the idea of extinction not being just something from the fossil record, but then also as something which is being caused by humans today. I come back to that. And so salamander species, I visit many of which are endangered. But here in the order Caudata, which is the order of salamanders, there are different suborders with the Cryptobranchidae, known from the Jurassic period, with a couple of fossils, which I've represented here. So just as frog suborders evolved over time, so too did the salamander suborders. Okay. Some salamanders today can be 4 feet long. They are the largest amphibians alive today. Finally, I'll get to Sicilians. Sicilians are the third group of amphibians in the world today. So modern amphibians include frogs, salamanders, and Sicilians. So here, once again, there are these different suborders of salamanders which evolved over time. Let me get to I'm sorry, I'll get to it. So Sicilians are legless amphibians. Now, there have been legless amphibians in the past, the Tetrapods of the Paleozoic. But what you just saw is a modern Sicilian. So this is a type of amphibian. The third group, frogs, salamanders, and Sicilians, are the 3 groups of amphibians alive today. The first Sicilians known from the Cretaceous still had their legs, so they were transitional fossils, and they still had a number of primitive skull bones not found in modern Sicilians. And so Sicilians have evolved over time, with the first Sicilians being transitional fossils. Sicilians today are limited to the southern continents and include some endangered species. Okay. And so this video has started before there were vertebrates on land, but addressed fish that over tens of millions of years gradually adapted to life on land. Considered the first amphibians, which were not modern and still retained many transitional intermediate features from their fish ancestors, and then considered the then gradual evolution of the 3 groups of amphibians alive today. And as I had said, the videos which I skipped over largely then go through the families of frogs, salamanders, and Sicilians alive today, and also then kind of highlighted that amphibians are facing a number of threats in the modern world, and that many are in danger of extinction.